So today we'll talk about everything that you need to start a video podcast. Maybe you've seen some of the videos that we've been pushing out across both EntreNetwork and Young Creatives, and you have questions about, hey, how do I actually get into video podcasting? Well, this is the episode for you. We'll dive right into it.
Welcome to EntreNetwork, brought to you by Revision Marketing Group. This podcast is meant to serve as an entrepreneurial knowledge base of wisdom and practical tips in marketing, branding, and technology to help grow your business effectively.
First, we want to kind of talk about, or I want to kind of talk about the importance of a video podcast or what it can do. So why did we get into video podcasting? Well, one, we know that the personal brand is extremely important. People buy from people, not a business. So for Revision Marketing Group, it's basically just a name. But if you talk to Sydney Jackson or you talk to Michaela Anderson or Christian or Sarah, who's the new hire, if you talk to these individual people, you'll build a relationship with them as individuals before you build a relationship with Revision as a brand. It's a lot easier to build a relationship with the person and not the business. So that's why it's extremely important. People buy from people, and people love faces. At least some of us do. So with that, showcasing video and showcasing our face a lot on video podcasts allows for us to be a little bit more likable. You can also see some of the passions that we have and things like that. So people love faces. Also, it allows for you to be a lot more social. So we bring on a lot of guests, both across the world and here within the Shreveport-Bossier area in Louisiana. It allows for us to just have open conversations with people as it relates to marketing, branding, technology, and just being young. Of course, with your podcast, it's just going to depend on who your target audience is, but being social is super important for us as an overall brand. But with that, video podcasting allows for us to be a lot more social. The next one is it allows for us to increase the reach. So for video podcasting, we, like I said before, we bring on different guests and things like that. But what a video podcast and how it sets you apart from just a traditional podcast is it allows for you to reach a broader audience. So if you're just doing like an audio podcast, of course you have things like Apple Podcasts and you have Spotify and Anchor and things like that where you can push content out on. But when you introduce video into it, you open up the realm of social media. So you have, of course, Twitter, you have YouTube, you have LinkedIn, all of these different social media accounts and things like that. But it increases the overall audience that you can capture. So that's another reason, the third one. And then the other one is it boosts shareability. So with video podcasts, especially if you cut the video podcast into bite-sized snippets for social media, it's able to be shared a lot more often. Pretty much people want to share that kind of content, especially if it's featuring someone that they know, like, and trust. And us, in addition to that, they build awareness to you as the individual and then overall brand. So from a business to business standpoint, the question becomes, well, what is the return on investment? With a video podcast or any kind of marketing tool, you have to consider return on investment. It's pretty much the same for if you want to do a new website. What's the return on investment over the course of 12 months? Or if you want to get into search engine optimization, what's the return on investment for the first 6 months? How much does this actually cost to get started? Things like that. So with return on investment for a video podcast, it depends. It's a lot of different ways that you can get or realize a return on investment for an overall podcast. But at the top of it, you have to look at the feasibility. So you have to look at the lifetime value of the customer. Can you actually foot the bill for a video podcast initially investing in the equipment and things like that? Does it make sense for your overall business? That's always a really good question. So the lifetime value of a customer, Christian really built out this awesome blog post that talked about the overall marketing budget and talked about the cost of leads and things like that. But in that, she spoke about the lifetime value of a customer. So for lawyers or something like that, it's like 10, 20,000. Of course, these are made up numbers, but it's a lot per per client. So they can spend quite a bit more to actually acquire a customer. And it all goes back to breaking down the numbers, which she did extremely well in the blog post that we have on the website. But aside from that, it just depends. So, of course, you have sponsorships and things like that where you can get a return on investment. But the biggest thing is building a community. So you want to build a community of people that know you, like you, and trust you. And with that, they would recommend people shop with you because it's you as the individual, and they feel like they know you and you add value to the community that you're building with the video podcast. So with that, it's like, do you have the bandwidth or cash flow to actually sustain a video podcast until you start getting more awareness to yourself as the individual, and then your people as individuals to actually bring in additional revenue based off of the podcast. So it's a lot of different strategies that you can go with to monetize a podcast, but that's always the question: what's the return on investment? And like anything else, the best things comes to those who wait, or some cliche like that. But it's somewhat like search engine optimization, where once you get the content strategy going, you benefit a lot because then you can transcribe and put it onto blog content and things like that. So, yeah, it's just incredible. The other thing is, do you have the bandwidth to sustain or commit? So, of course, you're looking for some kind of return on investment. The other side of it is, what's the return on the time that you spend on it, right? So if you're doing like a weekly podcast versus a bi-weekly podcast, can you or your team actually commit to it? And this came up last week where I was kind of spread a little thin. So when I didn't do a podcast last week, just so I can focus on pretty much everything else, taxes. But with that, the question becomes, do you have the bandwidth to commit, or do you have multiple people on your team that can commit to doing a podcast so you add value to the community that you want to build? And I'm keep talking about community without getting into the overall target audience. So this brings me into the next segue, which is understanding the target audience. So before we even talk about like equipment and things like that and overall branding and editing process and stuff, we'll talk about the overall target audience, because with a video podcast or any kind of podcast or content that you create, you always want to have the target audience in mind. So for us, or for EntreNetwork, the target audience, of course, is going to be in the name entrepreneurs and CEOs of companies. So with that, we want to provide as much value as possible. So that's educating people and also bringing on different guests onto the podcast where they talk about their overall story. So other entrepreneurs that's trying to get into entrepreneurship wouldn't have to repeat the exact same thing that they went through. So, of course, that's called wisdom and stuff like that. And that's the value that we're trying to create with EntreNetwork, and build a community of entrepreneurs and CEOs that get practical tips on marketing, branding, technology, and also wisdom from some of the seasoned entrepreneurs in the area. Speaking more so about target audience, so you want to understand who your target audience is, because it becomes a lot easier to start creating content and adding value, because it's like, oh, well, Sarah from such and such, she's looking to learn more about video podcasting, or she's just looking to grow her business. So I know exactly the pain points that she's speaking about. So with that, of course, it's going to be dependent on what business you're in, but you want to understand your target audience. We'll talk about this a lot, because it's extremely important. From the copy or the text content that you write to the way that you talk to what you talk about, it's all geared towards your target audience. And on a side note, for me, with like personal branding, a lot of the stuff that I want to talk about on the podcast, it's not geared towards like the overall target audience from a revision or EntreNetwork standpoint. So that's when you can actually produce content and share it on your personal account, where you still benefit from creating the content because you're still establishing yourself as an expert. But the target audiences may be a little bit different from platform to platform. So you want to be conscious of that as well. But understanding the target audience is critical. The other thing that you want to consider is the overall format. So before we talk about the numbers, talk about what's actually needed for a video podcast, I want to kind of talk about the overall format. So you have two that I know of anyway. You have online video podcasts, and then you have in-person video podcasts. So the online video podcast, the upfront cost is going to be a little bit less or a lot less because you don't have to invest in professional equipment such as lenses and cameras and lighting. Well, you still need lighting, and you still need like a really good webcam and probably a really good microphone and stuff like that. But the upfront cost isn't as much as if you want to do something that's in person. So with that, you have online. At first, we was using Zoom. Zoom is a really good platform for like podcasting or video podcasts because it simply captures both users if you have like a host and then a guest on the podcast. So you can use Zoom, definitely. Well, we moved away from Zoom because the quality was a little subpar, especially compared to the camera equipment that we have. So we invested in some really good webcams, and we looked at this tool called Riverside, which is an online video podcasting platform that, from a technical standpoint, is super cool. So what it does is it's a online interface, much like Google Meet or something like that, where you can see the users. Then on the other side of it, if you have a really good camera, it pretty much downloads that video onto the person's computer. So if you're on Zoom or something like that and you have internet issues, that's gonna reveal itself in the quality of the video. But with Riverside, what I love about it is it downloads the video locally on each user's computer. So if I'm doing a video here on a laptop or something like that, it downloads to my hard drive. And then if I'm doing a podcast with Michaela, it downloads to her desktop, and then it uploads to the cloud Riverside, and then where it kind of stitches everything together, and the quality is really good. And we don't have to really be too overly concerned about the overall internet stability. So that's a really good platform for online video podcasting. It's a bunch more out there, but that's the two that I really recommend. Riverside a lot more than Zoom, though. The other thing is in-person as far as the overall platform. So if you have in-person video or an in-person video podcast, it's going to be a lot more as far as like the upfront cost of it, because you have to consider a lot more as far as like investing. But you also have to look at the overall format of what you're trying to do before you start investing into anything. So is it going to be long form, or is it going to be like extremely short snippets where you can do something more handheld and you don't have to have a really good production location or something like that? You also want to consider the audio and things like that. But getting back onto the in-person one, the overall format of it. So for us, it's pretty much we have the intro and then we have the long form video without any B-roll. B-roll is pretty much filler content or video content that supports what you're actually saying. So for us, it's just going to be extremely, hey, this is the clip, and then this is the end of the clip as far as video content, because the content speaks for itself. And once you start bringing in B-roll and stuff like that, it's just going to increase the overall production cost. Of course, it increases the production value as well. But for us, going back to it, looking at like the lifetime value of the customer and then bandwidth for commitment to stuff like that. So you just want to kind of consider all of these things before you dive into a podcast. The other thing is branding. So you want to make sure that you have a really good brand. So understanding the target audience, your branding is pretty much going to come from that a little bit as far as how you speak or what you talk about, the overall topics that you talk about, the overall attitude that you have towards the content or the voice that you have towards content, whether it's like more so educational or it's more trendy or funny, things like that. The overall voice is going to be dependent on the target audience. For smaller businesses, I always say, hey, be yourself, because it's super important to be yourself and really love what you're doing. Because if you have a target audience that personalities just don't align, it's going to be tough to really do video podcasting and add enough value and also showcase your personal brand. But with that, I think the more that you showcase your personal brand, it's just going to be easier to create the content. The other thing is branding. So you have the logo, making sure that you have some kind of logo, some kind of brand kit with the color scheme and things like that, the typography. So for us, branding is extremely important, but big part that we was trying to make sure was consistent was the brand, how it looked on the website and social media and stuff like that. So it's easy to make that consistent when it comes to like overall graphics and typography on websites and things like that. But once you introduce a video into the mix, trying to stay on brand with the typography and the fonts and then the elements and things like this and the animations is extremely hard. So that's why you want to stay as simple as possible and let the content speak for itself, where you don't have to do a lot of upfront work producing all of these things that's destined to change in the future. Because with podcasting, you want to be as flexible as possible, because what if the overall target audience changes or the pain points that they need kind of changes? So you want to make sure that your brand is able to flex a little bit to that, and also flex to you as an individual or your team as an individuals, because that's important as well, where this may not be the most exciting time or something like that, or just making sure that you can change. You don't want to be stuck in one box. And funny story, side note, for young creative, I give like all of the creative control to the team. Before we hired Sarah, who's our media coordinator, I was pretty much doing the After Effects template and stuff like that, where I had to go in there, customize the colors and the typography, put in photos, put in footage and stuff like that. And it was a lot. So with that, just having something so highly produced, it pushes us to not be able to change too quickly, but we're still able to change. So it was important that I was able to make it a template so we can go ahead and change the overall color scheme in the future, or change some of the graphics and things like that if the team wanted to change. The last thing that I wanted was for them to be kind of like stuck in an overall brand and then they outgrow it. So you want to be conscious of things like that. But going past that and getting into the meat and potatoes is the overall equipment. So equipment for a podcast, you have a lot of different solutions for equipment. And I'm looking around, just looking at some of the equipment that we have. Most of the time, it just depends. Of course, the foundation that you need is going to be a camera, lenses, microphones, SD cards, tripods, lighting, batteries, and some pretty good accessories. The other thing is, if you have like a location or something like that, you want to make sure that you have soundproofing somewhat anyway, or a really good location that you can record a podcast in. So going into some of the technical stuff as far as cameras and stuff, we use a GH5, which we're recording on right now from Panasonic. Then we have 2 GH4s. So we have 3 cameras in total, at least for Panasonic. And then we have 1 Sony A7 III. So for the Sony, that's mainly used for photography and handheld video, as we're getting more and more into the handheld quick video content. As far as lenses, you have a lot of different options, but we mainly use the native lenses for the GH5. I am not certain what it is. I think it's a 13 to 35 millimeter or something like that. We usually use, for the Canon or the Sony lenses, for the GH5 cameras, we usually use a speed booster, which allows for us to connect to a different lens type or mount type. So we invested into Canon lenses, Canon EF mount lenses anyway. So we have Sigma 18 to 35 on the speed booster attached to like the GH5 or the GH4. And then we have the Canon 24 to 70, which is that's a beautiful lens. But with that, it allows for us to get a lot more separation from the background. And then, of course, with the Sony, we have an 85 millimeter that we don't really use a lot for video content for the podcast, because the color is just a little bit different but that's gone into the nitty gritty. As far as microphones, you need you need a microphone or additional microphones if you have different guests that's coming on the podcast and things like that. So for us, we use the Rodecaster Pro, and then we use the Rode Pod mic. Yeah, pod mics. And we have 4 of them, just in case we had like 4 different people on the podcast, which we recently did for the Young Creative podcast. And then, of course, like arms for to actually hold the mics and things like that. So pretty basic accessories. As far as going wireless, we looked at the ability to do that. So we ordered some Rode Wireless Go's version 2, which allows for you to just snap a wireless mic on a person, 2 people. It's a 2-person system. So we'll be testing that out, the overall quality of it pretty soon, but definitely some kind of XLR microphone so you can really get that quality overall. Of course, you need SD cards, depending on what kind of camera that you get. I recommend at least 64 gigabytes for SD cards, because if you're working with like 4K footage, it's going to be a lot of footage. We won't get into the storage of footage and stuff like this. We'll most likely be creating a blog post that goes a little bit more in depth as far as everything that you need. But the other thing is going to be tripods, lighting, and then batteries. So I think that's all that I can think about right now. And headphones, of course. The other thing that you want to consider is going to be editing. So editing is probably going to be the most time-consuming process for a video podcast. If you had just kind of like a traditional podcast where it's just audio, send that audio off and get it professionally mastered and things like that. But if you have a video podcast, you may need someone to be in-house, or you may need a company that can handle all of the data that's been generated. So if it's an online video podcast, it's a little bit easier because the file sizes are not as big as what it would be for an in-person video podcast. So you also just have to kind of consider that too. So if you do have online video, you can go ahead and outsource the editing process for that, both for the audio and the video. You can just work with someone and they can give you the overall format. MP3 works best for us, push and pull levels and things like that, and separate different mics. The other part of it is we outsource it or get equipment to handle consistency at which you pump out video content. And if you guys are interested in knowing exactly what we use, just let me know in the comments and I'll go into depth about it. High level, we just invested into a network attached storage, which allows for us to have multiple editors to edit and also produce like short snippets that go out on YouTube and things like that. But with that, the overall workflow is just different. So each workflow is going to be different for different businesses. But consider all of these factors before you jump into a video podcast. And if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments, or you can direct message me. I'll be happy to kind of assist, because I think video podcasting is the future and it provides a lot of value to the community that you're trying to build, and also you as an individual, and then your overall business. So thank you guys so much for tuning into the EntreNetwork podcast. Until next time.